Shall we start now? Okay. Hello and good afternoon. I know there is many interesting other panels and craft sessions going on, so I want to thank you for choosing our craft session and being here. We are really excited to talk to you and tell you about the work that we have been doing at NIST around development of a risk management for AI systems. So directed by a congressional mandate and released in January 2023, NIST AI Risk Management Framework is a voluntary framework to manage the risk of AI systems in a flexible, structured, and measurable way. It was developed in an open, transparent, collaborative process with tons of inputs from industry, academia, civil society. We reached out to computer scientists, mathematicians, statisticians, but also sociologists, psychologists, cognitive scientists, philosophers, everybody that should actually be around the table discussing the design, development, deployment, or use of AI systems. The first part of the AI RMF lays out foundations and provides an interoperable lexicon to discuss risks of AI systems. It provides definitions for risks, provides a taxonomy of risks, talk about AI life cycle, AI actors involved in the different stages of their AI life cycle, and their roles and responsibility for AI risk management. The second part of the AI RMF is, which call them the core functions, is basically the guidance for mapping, measuring, managing, and governing AI systems. And then each of these functions get into more, next slide please, more granular guidance in terms of categories and subcategories. In total, through 72 actionable outcome-focused guidance, AI RMF provide guidances and suggestions for managing of the risk of AI. So I put some examples of what's covered in each of the functions to just show you that, for example, in the map, it talks about impacts to individuals, groups, communities, organizations, and societies are characterized. It tries to lay out the objective, the outcome that needs to be achieved, but not be prescriptive about what the way and the mechanism and the methods that we need to get there. Having said that, the playbook for the AI RMF provides a lot of suggesting actions on how to achieve this outcome-focused guidance. I'm not going to take any more of your time. The way the sessions is scheduled is that we are having 15-minute talks for each of these functions to get you into exactly what the functions are and how to implement and use them. So with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Riva that's going to talk about some use cases.
Thanks. So the framework is designed, purposefully designed to be general, so that it can be adopted within specific use cases, specific contexts. To illustrate our examples today in this tutorial, we wanted to give you all, and we tie our own presentations to these two just general examples. And of course, we chose generative AI because of course we did. And we are tying them on kind of a continuum of contextuality. So we have a call center example, which is a highly contextual scenario in a non-regulated environment. Generative AI being used in many, many different ways here to tailor the tone, for example, tone or style of content, to increase fluency within the language required. This is usually in English, or to just train continuously train on the data. And then in a banking context, which is much lower contextuality because there's a smaller set of tasks that could happen in this setting because it is highly regulated. So the banking industry has restricted access to generative AI for the most part, and when they're involved with it, they're mostly just experimenting with chatbots or other automated tasks. I will now hand it over to Sina, to Kathy. Kathy is on video, is on Hopin. Can you hear us?
have to text mandatory disclosure.
Keep your answers.
Do you hear me, Kathy?
So these in the category column, we have the different elements of our govern function. And imagine that you are. No, did not hear you. I hear you now.
I feel older.
I can hear you now, Sina. Can you hear me?
Yes, but I said that previous thing 1 minute ago, and this you will probably hear it 1 minute from now. Just, I hope you're safe out there.
We might have some technical.
I'm also the tutorial chair, so I'm like very ashamed.
It's a great group exercise. So. Yeah, it's amazing.
That sounds like governance.
Exactly. Performative governance.
Got everybody in the same place.
Oh, there's no internet.
I'm not exactly sure. Should we jump to the next slide where we have some answers and maybe review the answers?
Good job, everyone.
All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, yay, we have text in there. All right. So using the example of a call center, some of the activities that you might do on for category number one, you're going
we answered the question. Do you hear me in the room? Okay, fantastic. So next slide. Okay, so as Kathy said, thanks, Kathy. As Kathy said, the govern function provides us with the type of organizational embedding that is needed to support and so, as Kathy said, this is like my nightmare. I feel like I'm a ghost, like floating away. Is it good? Okay. So govern provides us with the organizational embedding that is needed for supporting and sustaining our efforts towards our ultimate aim, which is manage AI risk, right? So the next thing to do is for us to figure out what is the relevant context of evaluation and intervention when we are trying to map and measure and manage these risks. And this is very important. Many people in the FAC community have noticed that drawing the abstraction boundaries around the system that we want to evaluate is going to fundamentally shape what we take to be risk, what we take to be a potential source of it, potential response to it, and who we take to have the primary responsibility of addressing it, right? And this is very value-laden. So as a kind of foil or contrast example, you might imagine that for whatever reason, somebody for reason, let's say convenience, decides that our focus should just be on the AI model in abstraction from the rest of the thing. And many people, for a variety of reasons, have done this with respect to things like fairness, right? That shapes the way that they think about fairness. They think about fairness as a property of the AI model, some type of disparity in outcome. They think about solutions to fairness as interventions to the model, its learning, its input or output, and they think about the person or the team in charge of addressing this as mainly those who are coming from a certain type of technical background. But again, as many people in the FAC community have noted, that is a very narrow perspective that is going to misguide our effort. Put another way, as the AI RMF shows, it's good if we broaden our perspective and have a socio-technical lens on evaluating this system and thinking about how we want to intervene on it. That takes into account not just the AI model, but the variety of the social actors that are implicated in the process of design, development, and deployment, the organizational norms that manage the interactions between these actors and the actors on the technology, as well as the social setting that shapes the overall long-term impact of the technology. Now, obviously, doing this is going to be tricky because when you broaden your perspective, you suddenly have to consider all of these different choices and assumptions, and there are many of them, and they might interact with each other, and they require different types of expertise and knowledge to actually properly understand. So in order to address some of these issues and to establish the context for framing and interpreting risk, the map function tries to adopt a perspective that is process-focused, takes into account the life cycle of the AI system, takes into account the diversity of perspectives, experiences, and expertise that are needed for grounding and understanding of this system, and really prioritizes participation, and acknowledges that in many cases, even our best efforts might be limited. And so we have to go back, iterate different steps. If we lack in certain parts, we have to address it. And that this is not something that we do one time and we are done with it. This is a continuous application of this model. And the output of the map function, the idea is that it will tell us, it will give us some idea that can guide whether we should design, develop, and deploy this model. That is, it's a go, no-go output. And it can then inform, if we want to do this, how should we contextualize risks to measure and mitigate them. So there are many texts here, ignore all of them, which is like, it's good because like, you can look at me instead. There are 5 categories in the AI RMF function, and each one of them has many different subcategories. I will focus on the use case that is about the generative AI in the call center, and with particular focus on participation for the sake of time. So what is the first thing that we have to do for MAP? We have to establish some of the context. Now, this might sound pretty daunting and kind of scary, but the good thing in many cases is that we actually have quite a bit of background knowledge in most cases that we can rely on. This background knowledge comes from social norms that we have, organizational norms, standards, and policies that are for a particular sector, similar type of use cases. So in the case of generative AI, technology might be new, but the chatbots are not new, right? The call centers and organizational norms that govern them are not new. Similarly, many of the stakeholders that have been involved in that domain are not new, and their experiences we can rely on. So we also try to draw on the experiences and expertise of the relevant experts and also stakeholders that are implicated. So as example, a particular stakeholder is also the type of person who calls the call center, right? What is it that they value? Identify them and identify their value. They might value the speed of response. They might value the accuracy of response. For certain people, like non-native English speakers like me, you might, at least maybe not now, but when I first went to Canada, you might also want like clarity and like obviousness of the response. We were discussing that we couldn't even order sandwiches the first time that we went in an English-speaking country. So those are the things that you might value if you come from that section of a stakeholder group. For certain other people, such as the agents that are in the call center, they might value certain other things. Maybe they don't really want something that replicates what they do in giving accurate response, but they really want something that can efficiently do some things that they're not necessarily good at, such as retrieving information, right? And that's what they would want, efficiently. And that kind of grounds our understanding, forms our expectations about what is the relevant context for this technology. When we have that, then we can think about, is AI the right type of system for this? What are the other types of alternatives? If it turns out that it's the right thing, and the map function provides some type of guidance, some type of resources for telling us how we can do this, then we can consider, okay, I want to apply the AI system here. What are the variety of choices that I need to make? From the problem formulation to figure out what it is that this system is actually addressing, to the curation and selection of the data set, to the modeling, and to the way that the output of the system is actually going to be used, right? So again, participation is going to be important here. In the case of the generative AI for the call center, the data set matters a lot, right? So I don't know how many of you actually went to the craft session this morning. That was about annotator identity and different types of things. So it matters like whose view is actually going to be embedded in the data set and whose view is going to be promoted by the data set. Similarly, in modeling, there's a nice session tomorrow. Like if you want to prevent the system from giving toxic speech or like use harmful stereotypes, again, it matters what type of, where you think the source of the problem is and how you're going to address it, and is it going to have equal subgroup validity for different groups, or is it going to differentially impact a particular group? Same thing for the different stakeholder that we had, the call center agent, right? That's the preference that they have for efficiency of some part of the task over something that replicates their behavior or their capabilities can impact and influence what we decide to optimize, right? Maybe we don't want a system that optimizes for accuracy of response. Maybe we want a system that can make certain things quicker so that we can have the benefits of complementarity. That could benefit both the user, but also the people who give the call. When we identify these different choices, then obviously with each one of them there might be a benefit or potential harm that is associated. And again, so the map 3 allows us to provide guidance for how we might actually go about thinking about identifying these, documenting them, and keeping information about them. And here again, we need interdisciplinary knowledge to actually figure out. We need to how do human beings actually interpret and take up the information that is coming from the generative AI if there are call workers. So Kathy gave the example of misinterpreting the result. So one of the worries about this system is the misapplication. Like what if the call worker thinks that this is something like a Wikipedia when it's not, right? So you need expertise from different disciplines to be able to anticipate those type of issues and be able to address them. Next slide. Another source of risk that happens a lot is from artifacts such as data sets and software that comes from third parties, as well as personnel that come from third parties. And this is also there for language models, generative AI. Sometimes we don't exactly know what the provenance of the data set is that the model is pre-trained on. And so it matters to identify these potential fault modes that will impact all of the issues that I discussed with respect to the scientific integrity of choices. And keep that in mind. Again, it matters for participation, because if we have independent way of auditing, like where did our data come from, what is the properties of this model, that will kind of ground justified trust in the particular model. And when we have all done all of these things, then we can think about the impact, both the anticipated impact of the system before we deploy it, as well as the actual impact after we deploy it. And actual impact obviously matters, because despite our best intentions and best efforts, it might be that when the system is actually deployed, interactive dynamics of the environment leads to certain emergent outcomes that we did not expect, because it changes the environment. So here, map 5 provides guidance for how we should go about identifying means of receiving feedback, both about to estimate the likelihood of anticipated effects. So it might be incident reports, similar use cases, as well as feedback that can enable us after deployment to think about the system. So if there's a particular incident, how should we actually incorporate that feedback into our understanding of risk? And again, there are different types of risk here that matters for, let's say, the ease of reporting these things, the effectiveness of incorporating them into our understanding of risk. And that then enables us to measure things more clearly.
Perfect. So thank you. Now that we have mapped our risk, we want to measure them. And of course, I hope I don't have to convince you about this, but hopefully we all agree that measures are nothing without context. So it's really important to contextualize the numbers, the things we are measuring in the broader system. Once we start measuring things, another very important thing to do is to document what we are not able to measure at that time. Oftentimes in your organization, after you start measuring things, the things you can measure become the focus or the goal of your organization. So you may try to improve on those metrics. The risk of that is that what you cannot measure, then sort of the organization cannot see it anymore. And so that's why it's always important to be mindful of that and to be documenting this. Going back to what was said earlier, also a reminder, this is a continuous process. This is not something that we do once and we never come back to that. AI systems, especially nowadays, are evolving pretty fast, even if you think maybe, whatever system is currently in production in any organization, it might be constantly updated. This is important to keep measuring. That's why it's important to keep measuring after a deployment to make sure that the system keeps working as is intended. So there is a lot of things that could happen. There is data drift, there is model drift. You can probably agree that if we had a sentiment analysis system that was maybe trained 10 years ago on data on the internet of 10 years ago, it will maybe not perform as well as a system that was trained last week, even with the same technology, just because the language evolves so fast. Just to give an example. Cool. One important thing to notice, and it is, I think it's very important to acknowledge that, is measurement for AI systems in general are very complicated and very hard to do. All of these, as we mentioned earlier, are socio-technical systems. AI systems are systems in which the sort of like the human component and the algorithmic or machine component interact with each other. So it's really important and hard to disentangle the two. Another challenge that I want to mention is, which I realize is, oftentimes it's not trivial, but I've noticed that it's true in larger organization, is that, measurement, oftentimes we're not measuring what we think we're measuring. Oftentimes measurements are indirect. So for example, you might want to know if maybe your product is valued by the people who use it, and however, you never ask them directly if they like it. Maybe you just measure how much time they spend on your product. And then you can infer that, well, if they spend a lot of time on that, it means they like it a lot. This is potentially true, but it is not necessarily true. There is still a gap between the actual value they find in the product versus the time they spend. And so it is important to think and acknowledge that there is a little bit of, there could be a big gap between what we're able to measure and what we want to measure, and what we think we're measuring. And so why is that important? Because we might go into, if we keep optimizing the metric because we think we're measuring something, but in reality we're measuring something else, that could sort of like drift our entire system away. Another, as an aside, I also want to mention that even if you have the data that you think you have, talk with your data engineering people, because oftentimes the data you have is not the data you think you have. There's always a lot of problems in sampling, data is missing, someone called a column in a way that it's confusing, you think it's something, it's actually something else, and so forth. Anyhow, so just to say that having a large organization or working in a large organization can also present these other challenges, including the fact of, there are feedback loops. There are multiple kinds of feedback loops. So we talked a few moments ago about the feedback loop of human and computer sort of like interacting, but also there are feedback loops in the system themselves. So maybe a system fits in another system internally, and the measure of one has to be also very tied to the measure of the other. If you're changing one, if you're measuring on one system, how that ties to the other one. Finally, we mentioned it earlier, but it is vital that we have very good and very sort of like grounded stakeholder engagement. So again, what you're going to be able to measure is what your organization is going to be able to see. So how do we know if we have identified the right risk? Which communities are impacted? And again, this is a continuous system. So after our system has been deployed, is there a way for affected communities to maybe report that and have their measurement or their impacts be measured for new metrics to be developed? Next slide, please. So the AI RMF has 4 different categories in the measure function. Each of them has some subcategories. I think in all of it is 20 or something. So we're not going, obviously, it's been said earlier, don't think you have to implement all of it. It's not an all or nothing kind of deal, right? So it's important to pick up the part that makes sense for your problem, for your organization, for your current goal. So here, these are the 4 categories and what they mean. I'm not going to read the slide. You can do it yourself. However, one thing I want to mention is, so when you're presenting, so the question is how much measure is enough and how much is too much. One would think that the more information we have, the better decision we can make, which is in generally correct, I think. However, there is a threshold after which there is some sort of information overload, right? If you're asking, should I launch this system, should I make this model update, and so forth, and there are like 50 different metrics, and they are maybe, contradicting each other. then it will be really hard for practitioners to decide what decision they should take. So this to say that I'm not saying you should, sort of only measure everything in one single dimension, because that will be very wrong, and you would reduce a very complex problem, very complex socio-technical problem, to just one dimension. However, at the same time, be mindful of the fact that most people, and people who might be in charge of making this go no-go decision, they might not have all the context needed to understand all the 50 different metrics or measure you want to present to them. Cool. And then we'll budget for manage. Sure.
Thanks. Okay. We're doing really good on time, right? So I'll do just a very brief recap to talk about how we got here to manage. So we started with govern, which is where we kind of make the rules. We write policies and procedures, and we make documentation templates, and we build out organizational structures like committees and independent reporting chains and things like this. Then we map the risk. We put all the risk on the map. We try to understand our risk and document them. Then we want to measure them. And measuring is really important because it helps us prioritize our risk. And manage is when we actually take action to either accept, mitigate, or transfer risk, okay? So a really crucial aspect of risk management is prioritization. No one that I'm aware of, there's no entity that I'm aware of that has enough resources to manage all of their risk, okay? So we have to prioritize risk and pick the ones that are the most important to manage, okay? And then again, like I hinted at, we have different choices. And right now in the AI world, it seems like we're doing a lot of implicit acceptance of risk, right? We're deploying systems that have shown to be high risk with little management or governance around them, and that's sort of an implicit acceptance of risk. And so if we're going to accept risk in AI technologies, I think we'd actually like to make a more informed decision and go through the mapping and measurement process before we just decide to accept whatever risk there is with this AI system. There's also the sort of nascent notion of transferring risk, which essentially comes down to insurance. I think we'll know that the AI market has reached a fairly high level of maturity when you can go and buy insurance for your AI systems. And there's a little bit of that now. It tends to be linked in with cyber insurance policies, but not much of it. So again, I think that kind of points to the immaturity of the current AI market. And then, the thing that we often want to do with risk is we want to try to mitigate them. And what you see on the slide are some kind of common risk mitigation steps that people take with AI and machine learning systems. And two things that I'll point out right off the bat are there are these very boring but established practices of data management and data governance and model risk management. And these are not new and fun topics that a lot of us will be writing papers about, but nonetheless, they're fairly well practiced within some large organizations and can be effective risk mitigants. And specifically on sort of the AI and machine learning side, if you haven't read the document by the Federal Reserve, the US Federal Reserve, that goes by the code name or the abbreviation SR 11.7, I would send you that. It's like a 25-page paper written in fairly plain English that discusses kinds of governance and risk management strategies for predictive models. And it's been practiced in large financial services organizations in the US and Europe and probably other places in the world for about 10 years now. So it has some track record. Pardon me, I just want to make sure I hit everything. So other things that we can do to sort of mitigate risk in machine learning is that we can use business rules. And if you want to feel fancier, you can call them model assertions. But for a long time, people have used business rules to sort of box in the predictions of probabilistic or stochastic systems, right? And so the example I give there is it's probably just not necessary to let a self-driving car go 150 miles an hour. So we can just put in a rule that says don't go that fast. If we know that our machine learning systems are going to be making potentially dangerous or harmful decisions, then we can act as developers and try to put some rules up to prevent those kinds of predictions. Another one that gets me is incident response plans. Okay, so I say just since the sort of release of ChatGPT, I have seen organizations discuss incident response plans for AI systems, but previous to that, I had never seen that before. And it's just interesting to me that I can go onto Amazon and buy a $100 microwave oven that comes with a really comprehensive troubleshooting guide and a warranty. But every $10 million AI system I've ever audited doesn't have a troubleshooting guide or a warranty. And so again, getting to this insurance, warranties, contracts, there are established methods for mitigating and transferring risk, and they can work on AI systems just like they've worked on other technologies for years. The disengagement, the quote-unquote kill switch, or the sort of safety switch that you see on the slide, related to incident response, this is a fairly effective technique for technology systems, but given the way that AI systems tend to work inside of large organizations, right, it's very rare that there's just a single script, a single keystroke that someone can do to turn off an AI system. I think it's a really good idea to have a way to turn off your AI system quickly, but that will take planning, right? There has to be a business person who has the authority to turn off the system. You should probably know how much it's going to cost, how much money you lose every hour or every day that the system is turned off. If I turn off this one system, are there downstream effects on other systems? Can the business person that would have the authority to turn off the system actually communicate with the technical person who would know how to turn it off? That's always a big question. And another huge one that's very simple that comes from a lot of the research we did in the course of the AI RMF is just talk to your users and allow your users to talk to you. So user feedback mechanisms. And that can be something like, you've probably noticed when you use the Google search bar, it gives suggestions, and then it allows you to report inappropriate suggestions. And that would be an example of a sort of a simple recourse mechanism that immediately kind of decreases the risk with that system, right? If the Google search bar shows me something offensive, I can report it immediately. I'm probably less likely to go take a screenshot and run off to the New York Times or something like that. There are more sophisticated recourse mechanisms that involve explanations. This is why we made this decision about you. Tell us how we got it wrong. But we can have these kind of user interface type recourse mechanisms, or we can just do good old-fashioned surveys and other ways of communicating with our end users. So this slide is sort of more related to the more traditional banking use case, where I would say that these are mostly risk mitigation approaches that have existed for a long time and are valid for many different types of technologies. The last thing I'd point out, too, is just software testing, just software quality assurance. Almost every AI machine learning system that I'm aware of is a software system, and I don't think we're testing our AI systems the same way that we test sort of the autopilot for airplanes or something like that. We could do a better job in general testing AI systems. So we can go to the next slide that's more aligned with the generative AI use case. So I would say that risk management for generative AI is very immature, but there are sort of standards out there, or not standards, but there are practices that are kind of coming online that we hope might work. And so that's what you see in the sort of favorable category on this slide. And then there are things that we've already seen fail. And so I would say those are in the questionable category. And I'll just highlight a few of these things, and then we'll turn it over for for audience engagement. Is that correct? Okay. So yeah, and again, I'm not saying whether generative AI works or not. Whether it works or not, we'll need to manage the risk because certainly people are trying to use it. So bug bounties are an interesting approach, and I think the reason I've chosen to highlight bug bounties is because they incentivize user feedback. So I think user feedback is very good for risk management. When we do bug bounties, we're essentially paying people for their feedback. And so I think that incentive, users are busy, right? I don't want to give people who I'm already paying money extra time, right? And so I think bug bounties are an interesting approach because they incentivize user feedback. Whoever said disclosure of interaction with an AI system, that was good. That was a really good comment. So the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, has made it very clear on several occasions that if you are sort of offering a service that might feel human to a user and it's not human, you need to be very clear about that. You need to be very clear about that, or you may be engaging in what they call a deceptive practice. So red teaming, I would just call it red teaming model validation, but that doesn't sound cool enough for generative AI, I guess. So we are starting to see organizations engage in model validation for generative AI systems, so sort of technical prompt engineering exercises and security exercises, and they seem to like to call that red teaming. But for me, it's just model validation. But we want to validate our models, whether they're generative or not. Another really, potentially interesting and effective risk management approach for generative AI, I think, would be session limits. Okay, like when there's this very unfortunate case in Europe where someone's family is alleging that someone committed suicide because they had this long-running conversation with a generative AI system. Why did the conversation have to last that long? Why was the New York Times reporter able to push the Bing chatbot so far, over and over and over again? If the session was rate limited, limited to an hour, limited to a certain number of questions and responses, we could potentially cut down on some of these risks. There's the serious issues of data privacy and intellectual property infringement that are kind of, when you put your data into the generative AI system, you want to be really careful about what is happening with that data. And then when data comes out of the generative AI system, you really want to make sure that it's data that isn't licensed or copyrighted. And generally speaking, I would say that these systems just aren't ready for use in sort of regulated applications. Like, you don't want to be giving medical advice or giving legal advice. They're just not ready for that, right? The overconfident wrong answers are a real problem in areas like law and medicine and finance. So I'll leave my comments there. There are ways to mitigate risk in machine learning. And I think maybe the last thing I'll say that I think is really crucial is risk mitigation doesn't always work. So it can fail, it can make things worse, and that's why you want to be very careful at mapping and measuring your risk so you know what's going on before you start mitigating them. And I think we're ready for questions. Okay.
Yep.
All right, let's see if there's a 2-minute delayed echo here, but I had a quick comment just about this is not my main question, but the difference between red teaming and model eval is that, at least it's supposed to be the case, that red teaming is explicitly third party, but I think a lot of tech companies are increasingly using red teaming incorrectly, basically, but there is a difference, and I think the third partiness is really important. But my question is like sort of a comment about the govern feature. I guess, first of all, thanks for the presentation of this. I think it's a really comprehensive framework. It's really great to hear. And yeah, thank you for presenting such a detailed, exposure of it. So this comment is a bit on the critical side, I guess. In the governance section, there were a couple of the examples where maybe I misunderstood something, but they seem like really good examples of what not to do if you were trying to govern for responsible AI. So the two things were an LLM gives false answers, so we want it when it instead of making things up, to just say, I don't know. To me, this is like kind of just a fundamental misunderstanding of how LLMs work. Like, they're not a knowledge base where you can know whether an answer is correct or not. So you would need a different kind of framework for what you expect the alternative to be. Like, you can't expect an I don't know out of an LLM. The other thing that is maybe the more problematic one to me is, so you have a team working on prompt engineering, and it keeps getting, I forget, like racist responses, let's say, or like things that are bad and you don't want. So the governance example response is to resource a sprint to ensure that that feature is finished on time, which just seems like a really bad incentive structure if you're just like, if you don't have this option that you mentioned, that you emphasized a lot in the other sections of just don't do it, or just have a kill switch type approach. So yeah, I just wanted to mention those two things, and thank you guys.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think it's important to note that the govern framework, all of the functions are general, and so how they are used and the decisions that are used within those organizations can be up for discussion, right? So whether it's best practice or not. So yeah, thanks for raising that. Any other questions? Oh,
and please line up here for the questions.
Hi. I don't mean to disagree, but I was just trying to think about learning when to defer. I think that's what they meant. I think it's a very old problem in computation, knowing when the thing is supposed to stop. But anyways, sorry. I was going to ask you about kind of theory of change. So I'm a humble bureaucrat. I'm only from the World Bank, so I apologize. I'm just trying to think in bureaucracies on how you implement these things. I was wondering if you folks had any suggestions on how to think about theory of change when it comes to these things. Like, what are the kind of processes or structures and so forth of how you go from, hey, I just read this great thing about NIST and now I'm implementing it and so forth. Yeah, thank you.
So I think
I'm going to sit down so I can write your answer.
Okay. So I think when you're working with especially a large commercial entity, right, that is there to make money, then I think, that's where my experience is, and the notion of incidence is very important. So in regulated verticals like consumer finance, like hiring decisions, there's a regulatory or a legal motivation. Outside of those sort of regulated verticals in the U.S., then for me, I think the notion of incidence is very important. And we could define incidence with AI systems in various ways, but it's basically when something bad happens. And so it can be very hard to have the different functions and people within a large organization agree on, well, what is fair, what is private, especially a global organization. But generally speaking, organizations can agree on, we don't want to have bad press, we don't want to get sued, we don't want to do things that are obviously going to result in negative consequences, and that can be sort of a fruitful way to start discussions around governance. Is this notion of an AI incident and how to avoid them as an organization.
And I'll just add one other thing, and we were leaving it for last, but I just say here. The other, from a different point of view for the theory of change. So the resources that's being put into implementing this is the resources that you're taking away from doing something else, and there should be a reason that why, and explanations, and hopefully a justification that this was the right decision. And you see that, I think number 5 on our roadmap is measuring the effectiveness of the AI-RMF, particularly because of the concept of the theory of change and all that. I think we had a question from here. Oh, thank you. Bob, oh, let's go here and then we go that way.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation, and this helped clarify a lot for me in understanding the NIST Risk AI framework. I'm on the local government side, and I think this goes for a lot of government. 95, if not more percent of the AI that we're using is stuff that we're buying, right? And so when we think of governance, basically all of it is around the third-party management. And it felt like a lot of the governance is about, right, like working with my internal models or how I'm adding it in. Maybe I just haven't read the framework, but is there much guidance around like that third-party kind of vendor management stuff that we can be looking at?
You want to answer this?
Both in MAP and in Manage, we have specific categories just on third party. And I will point out too that we also have a playbook. If you go to airc.nist.gov, you can find our playbook. So for every one of the 72 outcomes that you should be trying to meet, we have chock full of examples on how to meet those. They are not step-by-step, they're examples and references. So yeah, we explicitly call out third party across the framework. Hi, Irene. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Irene. I'm at Hugging Face. I am a huge NIST fan and a huge RMF fan. So I have kind of a content warning, disturbing-ish question around how do we measure and mitigate harms for populations that are generated and do not explicitly exist or don't have that distinction. That the explicit consideration here is for minors, and I'm thinking through image-generated content. Maybe that is a minor, maybe it's not, and you can't get that feedback from a population who cannot consent. How do we work with groups like that?
That's a great question, and I think an example of what in our parlance, what we would call an AI RMF profile. It's a specific identified risk category and a specific set of impacts. And so a profile starts with getting a group together who want to focus on how do we do an instantiation of this framework specifically for addressing this risk. And so you can, like the really cheap, quick way to do it is to just go through the entire the tables and identify which things, where to even start. But the point here is that these people do not have a voice, quite specifically. But they're not the only people who don't have voices. And so we advocate extensively for forms of participatory engagement throughout the entire framework. How you capture feedback, though, from minors is obviously a question bigger than can be captured within the framework as exists. It would have to be a specific profile would be my take, but
No, this is great, and these are great questions, and the well-formed criticism. This is going to stay a work in progress. So when we put AI RMF, we said that a revision cycle of every 3 to 5 years, and for the playbook every 6 months. Not only because the pace of the technology, because we don't know the answers, and everything that we did here is in collaboration with the community. So these are all really good questions that we're going to pass it back to you guys, the fact community and others, to try to find the answer for. So thank you for the question.
Hi. So I might have just missed this in the fog of jet lag, but I'm curious. So like, let's say I'm working in this call center, this hypothetical call center, and I want to implement what you're talking about. Are there steps that I can take, like a concrete sort of like at least a set of instructions to start with, to like what to do? If so, what are those, and how did you go about developing them? And if not, what might they be?
I can answer, but I might be very biased towards this. You can start. I'll start. So it's a framework, right? So it has, the guidance in the framework are, as I said, outcome focused. So it's trying to say the state that you want to achieve, what you want to get, without really prescribing exactly what you want to do because we want it to be flexible. Then the playbook talks a lot about the type of activities and suggested actions that can take you. As Riva said, at some point by design, we wanted this framework to be general sector agnostic. And then you said that, okay, I'm going to go use it for this particular sector. That means that all of these guidance needs to be tailored towards that particular use case. That's what we call profiles. So the RMF talks about development of the profiles and talk about sector-specific profiles that, if you are a call center and you want to use and, you want to either develop the AI system for your purpose or you want to go and buy one, then you go through, as Riva said, you can just literally go through each of these 72 subcategories and decide how it applies or not and what can be done. Development, we call them vertical profiles, sector-specific profiles. And activities for developing profiles more or less started with the community. We think that NIST should not be the one that develop profiles because development of the profiles requires domain expertise, and we don't have that. Plus, it's not going to be, regardless of how smart we think we are and we know everything, we're not going to have the bandwidth to do this. So by design, we are leaving it to the community, and we put a call for development of the profile. I think somewhere on the list, probably number 3, is development of the profiles for exactly doing what you said. We'll be happy to participate in the, some of these activities are going on, to sit there, but I don't know if what's the answer that you wanted to hear, but yeah.
I mean, the other thing, so you said you're starting out brand new. The first thing is governance. It's governance, governance, and more governance. And so, and we like to say, and it is true, that that it is not a step-by-step process, and there's a lot of things that aren't going to apply. But the first thing we have is, are you following law and regulation? Do you have the policies internally that you need to have? Do you have the team that you need to actually, the interdisciplinary team who can implement these things? So if you, kind of look at the subcategories and think about how to assess, some entity, some team within a given organization can assess, like, do we have these things? If we don't have these things, how can we get them? And that can happen, like, you can just get started with that. And then, and then in your case, the context is pretty well declared, right? You're doing a call center, but then you do have to identify what the risks are. What are the trustworthy characteristics that are really relevant here? Is it validity? Is it explainability? Is it accountability? And then you kind of map those and measure them and manage them. But I will hand over to Pat.
Just like hopefully super practical answer. If you haven't interacted with the documents very much, there's what we call the core RMF, which is sort of Govern 1.1 and Govern 1.2, Govern 1.3, that are sort of these outcome-focused, almost policy statements. And so what I would do is read those, and even for me sometimes, right, I'm more of a technical person, I kind of scratch my head about what that means, and then I go look in the playbook. So I think, like, start with the core RMF functions and subcategories that are written at a fairly high level, and then when you have questions about those, go to the playbook. And I think the key is there's no expectation, at least as of now, that you would do everything, right? Like, you would just pick you would pick the ones that you think would work well for your organization to get started.
And I would just say, and if you hate that and you don't like it, then we want to hear about it directly. And that's aiframework@nist.gov.
The last thing I add is that we have also asked organizations that have started using AI RMF to sort of share their use cases. So that's different than profiles. Somebody's using it and just go and say, and hopefully that also helps other people to figure out how to do this. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So, as a follow-up step, do you have it in your plan to kind of for the next stage, like, look into many different organizations that adopt the framework and then see how they are kind of like using the framework to be adopted, like the variances around it, and then kind of taxonomize them and then see how, in principle, like, this general framework gets applied? Do you have that in the plan?
These are all great questions, and this is what we love having this type of session. So that is our roadmap there, and a variation of what you just said is there. But really, to get there, this is a voluntary framework. We're really it depends on how much people want to share with us, and so far looks like that they really like to share with us, and we are also thinking about other things that we need to do to keep up the engagement that we did on development of the IRMF. In the development of the IRMF, we heard from more than 240 organizations. So how to keep them in the engagement going on strong to get exactly the stuff that you said. You know, we put it in our roadmap, and we hope to get it, but it also depends on what gets shared with us. Yeah, but thank you for that suggestion.
Great. Jat Singh, Turing Institute, University of Cambridge. Actually, I came in a bit late, so I'm sorry if this has already been covered, but it kind of flows on from the question earlier about dealing with vendors, because lots of systems are built on other systems. You know, one system from one vendor with a particular model might be built on another system from another vendor for another particular model. You might have 4 models plugged together by someone, plugged into something else, and so on. So do you think these things will work well up and down that whole chain, and how can we be sure that those organisations, either upstream or downstream, are suitably informed to manage the sorts of risks that can really, you know, kind of get messy very quickly?
Anybody wants to go? Okay, I'll go first and say that we really hope so. So that again goes to that flexible attribute of the framework. So an emphasis on iterations and teams to work on, and then also I said one of the other attributes is the structured way, the way that, you know, we lay out the life cycle, AI actors, roles and responsibilities, so that those type of interactions happen. So we had that goal in mind, and we hope that we write it with clarity that happens, but I think we'll figure it out.
Because in some sense, you know, an organization can only see so far. If you're just interacting with one vendor, your visibility is lost a few more down the train.
Should help with that. There's a lot of emphasis on transparency. If you go to the playbook for each of the subcategories, we suggest ways for transparency. Transparency, the way we define it here, is documentation that, you know, in implementing this particular subcategory, how you did it, what you did it. Those in a, you know, when everybody starts using it, those type of transparency and documentation can help the communications between the different vendors and across the value chain, as you said. I think Patrick also said.
Well, and ultimately this is a mapping stage, right? So all of these factors are risks that should be identified and mapped. The little nugget there in the framework is that, oh, well, you have to map and once you know what the risk is, and you can measure it. But figuring out what the risk is like, that's the $64,000 question. So yeah, that's just one example. But
I think they cover it. So the most important part is, you know, the playbook or whatever risk management guide you pick can't have bullet points for every single little thing. I do think if you go look in the playbook, you'll see advice. You know, I'm paraphrasing here, but like, don't chain too many of these systems together. And if you do, watch out for error propagation and watch out for, you know, feedback loops. And but really, it's what they're talking about that gets to it. It's the mapping culture that where a human reviews a document and says, but wait a minute, where does this set of predictions come from, or where does this input of the system come from? And so it's really more about developing cultural competencies around transparency and accountability that allow for all these one-off, or not necessarily one-off, but complex situations, because it's really hard to sort of give structured advice about every possible situation. But what you can do is try to build a culture that can identify these things and ask hard questions and deal with them.
Yeah. Great, thanks for that. I think we should be aware that, you know, there will increasingly be AI offered as a service. So saying don't chain models together, I don't think is practical given how these things will be deployed.
And one thing I want to point out, in his response, Patrick several times mentioned culture and culture change. And that's the ultimate goal of the AI RMF for us, right? You know, we understand the importance of the templatizing these things and checklists and how the convenience of applying these things. But we are also hesitant that reduce it to just checklists, and we want it to be purposeful and people put the thought in it, and ultimately get to that culture of understanding, measuring, and managing risk at all of the stage purposefully.
Doesn't this have a software bill of materials thing as well, from pedigree and provenance for software?
They are all related. So when we were developing AI RMF, we tried to, because there's a lot of really good work happened, SBOM is one of those, SSDF is others, software secure development. In development of the AI RMF, we tried not to boil the ocean and just focus on the risk unique to the AI and leverage other ones.
Hi, I'm Emily Hadley. I'm a research data scientist at RTI International. I know a couple of folks in the panel and should disclose that because I really like the AI RMF. I think it's a great tool. We use it at my organization. One comment I wanted to make was last week was the first time I got asked to write a paragraph for a proposal we're working on how we would use the AI RMF to help our solution. We are a federal government contractor, so we do a lot of work for the government. And so my question was, can you contextualize NIST's work in all of the other agencies that you're working with? Like, can I anticipate that agencies will know what we're talking about if they weren't prompted in the proposals? And alternatively, are there agencies who are working on anything else that I would expect to like FDA, for example, is coming out with their own series of regulations that don't necessarily conflict with the RMF, but would need to operate in tandem when we're kind of putting together our proposed work?
Yeah. Okay, I'll try my best. So in development of the AI RMF, we try to keep all of our colleagues across the different USG involved and engaged, and a lot of them also reached out to us. I think there is a good awareness of AI RMF across the government from where I sit, but I don't know everything. NIST is a non-regulatory, so you said FDA and all those, so they have regulatory power and they may use some part of the AI RMF, sometimes talk to us about all of these things, but again, that's our hope, that this gives that some sort of the grounding framework for communications and managing risk of AI systems. This came out in January. We are not about 6 months into this, but we are very happy with the uptake so far and the responses that we are getting, and we are really hoping that, yes, when you talk with any government agency or anybody someday on the planet, they know AI RMF. So it will be a long way, but hopefully we get there.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Hey there, Lane Harrison, Worcester Polytechnic Institute. This goes back again to the vendor question. I've been talking to other government organizations and small, medium manufacturers about AI a bit, and how they're going to go about it, and they keep mentioning, okay, we're going to have to procure this stuff. And I wanted to ask maybe a two-part question. One, it seems that there might be categorical differences in the risk of people developing AI models and tuning them within their organization, and people kind of navigating the vendor space. I wonder if that's something that it's reflected in the framework enough. And another aspect of it is I often hear of a need to support non-expert users again and again and again. And I'm sure in practice there's a large spectrum that we need to support here. But is there more than just a framework that we need to be paying attention to? Could it be training, something like that? Like, what are more tools at our disposal that we could tackle this?
I love to pass it to somebody else on panel because I don't want to dominate this, but I will just say that trainings and those should be on our roadmap somewhere. So we are actively doing some of those. But yeah, anybody else wants to answer that?
And Riva and Elham and anybody else, keep me honest. So just to be clear, I think each function has at least one category that specifically addresses third-party risk. So is that enough? I don't, probably not, right? And so please send emails, tell us what you think. And then in the playbook, there is what I'm aware of off the top of my head is there's guidance that's patterned off the banking vertical regulations for dealing with third parties. And so there is specific guidance there. Your question as to whether it's enough is a good question, because third party risk is one of the biggest risks in AI, certainly.
And I would just add that for the mapping of the risk, especially the user literacy and the understanding that they have, there's also some guideline in the map function and probably the other function, measure function as well, for understanding the level of literacy that they would need, how the information have to be presented, what type of things should be disclosed to the user, and like documenting all of these things. And the strategies for ensuring that that combined together, they actually achieve what it is that we hope that they achieve.
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, the reason why we have so much third-party content in there is because we heard it from the very beginning. Like, you have to deal with this. It has to be at the category level. You have to have outcomes specifically for that. So, yeah, we knew about it. We built it. If it's not good enough, we want to hear about it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Carson. I'm an undergraduate at Harvard right now, just thinking about AI regulation. And I think this is a really helpful tool, especially for like people who are using like AI systems for particular applications. One thing I'm curious about is how you envision this applying to more general purpose systems, which feel to me like pretty qualitatively different from applications. And one example I can think of is if you're creating like a model for like a specific sector, like it makes sense to like define the use cases and yeah, like inform users or like end users that you don't want it to be used for other purposes. But for general purpose systems, like it seems like they're just going to be very capable at a wide array of tasks, and defining particular use cases or doing things like, yeah, like defining this or having like some insurance system might have an opposite effect of what we want, of like taking the accountability and responsibility off of the developer of the system. So like in like the EU context, they released the initial version and then updated it later for general purpose systems. Just wondering how you envision this applying to general purpose systems, if it's something that might be a later update or if it's like built into this.
Great question. And the section in AI RMF, which is about 2 paragraphs that talks about profiles. We talk about sectoral profiles, which is the use case that we just talked. And then we talk about temporal profiles, that, you know, how to improve the risk posture. And then when we were developing the final draft, we added cross-sectoral profile, exactly for the reason that you're talking about, for algorithms that can be applied to, you know, general purpose and can be applied to the different applications. So we're thinking about this. Work is going on around this, and we are hoping to soon do some sort of a you know, activity around doing some sort of a cross-sectoral profile.
I will add, as a, maybe like from modeling perspective also, that like if it's too general purpose, I think risk might not be the right way of framing thinking about a system, because it will be very difficult. Kind of characterization of risk will be under-specified. If you are not sure about the use case, are not sure about the sector, so like at the level of sector, we have to have some type of a specification in order to be able to meaningfully talk about risks. Otherwise, it's very difficult to do that. And in fact, in many different functions, one of the suggestions is that in certain cases, we need to actually narrow down the scope in order to be able to actually responsibly and meaningfully talk about some of these things. So you cannot just talk about, let's say, generative AI as such, but generative AI in the context of a particular use case, that would make a little bit more sense. Not that like the framework will not have something about generative AI, but that's the idea. I think it's for those type of cases, it's important to figure out what is the right lens of looking at them, and risk might not be that lens.
Yeah, and I guess another way to say what he's saying is, and I hope this is a safe space to say this, if systems have very broad applications, they generally tend to be higher risk. It's much harder to manage risk when the application is so broad. And so I would hope that communities like ours would, you know, at least interrogate this notion of very broad purpose AI systems, right? And what are the benefits versus the sort of threats that they pose. So it's a basic tenet of model risk management that you need a narrow application to manage risk. And so that gets to what Sina is saying, that risk may not be the way to handle this, but I just feel it necessary to point out that, like, it's broadly understood that the wider the application, the higher the risk. And I think this is a great place to have that discussion, but I'll leave my comments there.
And I think did that answer your question? I think what we're trying to say is that if the scope is too big that everything is in scope, then nothing is in scope. So.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense.
And I see that we are on time. Oh, we have another question.
Thank you for this framework. I have one, might be a small question, but I'm curious about the nature of how the framework kind of thinks about maturity in implementing the framework. So is there a sort of a minimum viable way in which you can actually think about the framework as opposed to, I did everything in the framework and, I'm the most responsible company out there. So is there a way in which we can actually think about what maturity looks like in terms of implementing the framework and thinking through it?
That's a great question. Any thoughts on the panel? So on that, I will say, with 2-minute warning, I would say that, again, we wanted the framework to be general enough and flexible enough, have the right balance between not too complicated and not too easy. And I'll add to that we are a non-regulatory agency. Nothing there we could go and say that's a shall thing and that's a minimum. We have some ideas and thought. We think that, as Riva said, a lot of things in govern function should be minimum thing that people have to do, but that's not quite our job to do. So based on the input that we can get from the community, we can think about, and you can just, based on your input, we can justify why such a things as a guidance is important. So love to hear those type of comments from the community. And that, I think we are about time. I want to thank all of you for your attention, for your participation. And please keep in touch. This was a great conversation, and please keep in touch. Thank you.